Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello again from me, Chris Bezick. Today we've got part 2 of our feature on the Manchester, the unsung aircraft that paved the way to the Lancaster. Jim Clancy, Avro member and Manchester enthusiast, is going to share with us a couple of major incidents from Manchester combat operations that illustrate really well many of the features of the aircraft, good and not so good, that he talked to us about in the last episode. And at the end of this episode, he will reflect on the legacy and the long-term impact of the Manchester. But what he recounts to us first are 2 archetypal tales of wartime with bravery, resolve, prodigious flying skills, wise judgment, and, in the end, sheer luck, all playing a key part in determining outcomes. They help us understand a little better the tremendous responsibilities that young pilot officers had to carry, skippers with the lives of their crew members literally in their hands and their feet, and the awesome judgment calls which they had to make, with an outcome of life or death hanging in the balance. I met up with Jim again in our studio and began by putting it to him that there was probably no shortage of stories of the challenges that the crews of the Manchester had to face.
There are, yes. There are endless stories about the difficulties of flying the Manchester. I've picked out 2 in particular that I think people will appreciate. One because of its connection to the company itself, and one where there's a special story that the motivation for that will become clear. So first of all, let's talk about Pilot Officer Kipper Herring. Kipper Herring flew numerous sorties on Manchesters, but the one in particular we're going to talk to was a sortie to Berlin in September 1941. And it was eventful, shall we say. So they took a route that took them to the north, first of all, and they approached Germany from the Baltic. And on that approach route, they managed to avoid, not quite sure how, but they managed to avoid 5 separate attacks by night fighters before they even got over Germany. But they got to Berlin without any significant damage. And as they were dropping their bombs on the target, they were hit several times by flak. And the primary problem that they had as a result of that was that it took out the port engine. So they're over Berlin, which is one of the furthest possible targets the RAF could fly to at the time. A very long journey back home. Only one engine. And they all knew very well what that meant in terms of the problems that we've already discussed. But the knock-on effect of the port engine itself being taken out was that they lost all the hydraulics in the aircraft. So that meant that the gun turrets were useless and they were totally defenceless. So the first thing they did, they set a course for home, and the gunners started stripping out and jettisoning any equipment that they could possibly get off the aircraft to reduce the weight. They were down to 5,000 feet before it stabilised, and they were able to maintain height. And at that point, Kipper Herring, the commander, had to make a decision. So he offered the crew the option of trying to get home or bailing out over Germany. And the crew, to a man, decided to stick with him and try and get home. So that's what they did. Now, one of the things to bear in mind about this situation from the pilot's point of view, if you lose an engine on a 2-engine aircraft, you have to apply opposite rudder in order to keep the aircraft flying in a straight line. And that is a permanent requirement. It's not something you have to do every now and again. Your foot will be down on the rudder pedal throughout the flight. Eventually, they reached the Dutch coast without any further adventures, and they managed to get across without being detected, which was a miracle in itself, given the defences that the Germans had set up on the Dutch coast. But they were fully expecting to have to ditch in the North Sea because they didn't think they'd make it all the way back. But the Manchester kept on going, and that is to a large degree down to the skill of the pilot. Kipper, as he was known. And as dawn broke the following morning, after a 5-hour flight, they actually managed to get back to their base. And Kipper, still applying full opposite rudder to compensate for the lost engine, prepared to land the aircraft. Now, they had to use the emergency system to get the undercarriage down because they had no hydraulics. But unbeknown to anybody on the aircraft, the tyre on the port wheel was flat. So when they touched down on the right wheel first because of the potential issues on the left-hand side with the wing and the engine that was out of action. When the left-hand wheel came down, the aircraft skewed off to port immediately, and there was a dodgy moment where they thought they were going to collapse. They managed to stop the aircraft. It was in effect a safe landing in the circumstances. But it was only when they emerged from the aircraft that they realised that one of the other conclusions of the flak attack over the target was that they lost their dinghy. The dinghy was lying somewhere in Germany. So if they'd had to ditch in the North Sea, they would very probably not have survived. So the connection with Avro, other than the fact that they were flying a Manchester, was that the story got about of how Kipper Herring had managed to nurse this aircraft back from Berlin on one engine. And he and his crew were invited to Woodford to be feted by the firm and had a dinner with Roy Dobson, managing director, and Roy Chadwick, who of course was the chief of the design team that designed the Manchester. He did also get some kind of award for that. I'm not sure if it was he might have got a DFC for that, Kipper Herring. So that's a story that illustrates many aspects of the Manchester itself in terms of the engine problems, the resilience and courage of the crew to do their utmost to get the aircraft back home. Move on now to a slightly different story, which says more about individual courage. And that's the story of Pilot Officer Leslie Mansa. The first 1,000-bomber raid took place in September 1942, and the target was Bremen. This was only a few months after Bomber Harris had taken over Bomber Command. And it was one of the things where he was wanting to make a statement, but it had never been done before. And one of the problems they had was actually getting together 1,000 bombers in a fit state to fly over Germany. And one of the ways that they did that was there was frantic activity in the weeks leading up to the target date for the sortie in terms of finding airworthy aircraft that could be used. And some Manchesters that had been deemed unfit for operations and were flying on conversion units were commandeered and delivered to squadrons to use. And
So this was to make up the 1,000?
To make up the 1,000 bombers, yeah. Pilot Officer Mansa ended up commanding one of these conversion unit Manchesters, which had actually done very little operational flying. So they get to the target okay. Mansa was particularly determined to get the bombing run right. And just as they dropped the bombs successfully, and they were holding the line for the obligatory photograph that they were supposed to take of the target, the aircraft was caught in a searchlight and hit by flak. In fact, they were riddled by flak. Mansa put the aircraft into a dive immediately to try and avoid the searchlight, but they were hit repeatedly until they reached a height of about 700 feet out of range of the searchlights. So he immediately started to climb to reach an acceptable height in case he had to ask the crew to bail out. At this point, the rear gunner reported that he'd been hit by shrapnel and that the tail and the rear fuselage had also been damaged. They got to 2,000 feet and the port engine exploded and burst into flame. The automatic extinguisher didn't work, but the fire shortly burnt itself out. So they're still climbing or trying to climb on the one engine. The wireless operator had to go to the rear of the aircraft and administer first aid to the rear gunner, who was not seriously hurt, but bleeding a lot. And Mansa set course for home and tried to assess his options, all the time struggling to keep the aircraft at a level height on the remaining Vulture, but heavily hampered by the damage to the tail of the aircraft. Again, the crew hurried to jettison as much equipment as possible so that they could lose as much weight as possible. And as they crossed the Belgian border, the remaining Vulture started to overheat and they started to lose airspeed. So the pilot, Mansa, was having significant control difficulties as the port wing kept dipping, causing the aircraft to bank and yaw off course, and all the time it was losing height. The starboard engine temperature was rising, and the probability was that it was going to seize up and catch fire any minute. So at that point, Mansa made an extremely brave and actually very well-timed decision, which saved the lives of his crew, but cost him his own. He ordered his crew to bail out, and he kept the aircraft on an even keel, which involved an awful lot more than that simple sentence suggests in the circumstances. So the 6 other crew members all escaped the aircraft, including the wounded gunner, and up ahead, Mansa finally lost control. The aircraft flipped over and crashed, killing him instantly. Of the 6 survivors, 1 was taken prisoner, but the others, miraculously, managed to evade capture and all got back home to the UK, which is a story in and of itself, which we haven't got time to go into here today. But based on their reports of the incident, Mansa was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. And I'll just read the citation for the Victoria Cross. In pressing home his attack in the face of strong opposition, in striving against heavy odds to bring back his aircraft and crew home, and finally, when in extreme peril, thinking only of the safety of his comrades, Flying Officer Mansa displayed determination and valour of the highest order. Coincidentally, Leslie Mansa was the brother-in-law of a British Army captain called John Randall, who was also posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross in 1944. And John Randall, when he was at Oxford, was a great friend of Bomber Command legend Leonard Cheshire, who was another VC winner, of course.
Jim, 2 things before we finish. 1, you've mentioned a book that was quite important in all your research. I want to just give the title and the author, anybody who might want to pick up on it.
Yep, sure. So the book is called The Avro Manchester, The Legend Behind the Lancaster, and it's by a gentleman by the name of Robert Kirby. I've been basing my research on the 2nd edition. I've subsequently learned there is apparently a 3rd edition not long published, but it's an absolute Bible if you're interested in the Avro Manchester. I doubt if there is anything about the Manchester that you couldn't find in it. So I strongly recommend that if you're interested in the Manchester.
Finally, how would you sum up this aircraft in a few words?
So I think the sentence that most that headlines the conclusions about the Manchester is probably the one used by test pilot on the Lancaster prototype when he talked about going from beast to beauty. In that period when the Manchester was being developed, a very accelerated development because of the circumstances that we've talked about. I think priceless lessons were learned about the production, manufacture and bottom line requirements of truly heavy bombers. The staff at Avro and Rolls-Royce worked tirelessly to improve the aircraft and solve the problems associated with it. The production methods perfected on the Manchester, distributed modular manufacture followed by assembly at Woodford, provided the framework that allowed Avro to peak at producing 7 to 8 Lancasters per day. I think that was in 1943. And they were also key to improved repair time because of that modular assembly. Without the Manchester, the Lancaster would never have existed. It was the logical progression of the Manchester, and the original prototype, as we said, was the Manchester Mark III, and that was always the intention that Roy Chadwick had. The Manchester itself, despite the engine problems, was a fundamentally sound airframe, which resulted in an astonishing legacy. Not just the Lancaster, but also the Lincoln, the York, the Lancastrian, and the Shackleton were all based on the Lancaster airframe. So the Manchester filled a role in providing the best and latest top technology, notwithstanding the engines, that was available at the time for the hard-pressed Bomber Command crews in the early part of World War II. As Bomber Harris subsequently tried to do, the strategy of taking the fight to Germany.
So for a forgotten, or at least not very well-known aircraft, it did pretty well.
It did indeed.
Jim, thank you so much for telling us the story of the Manchester. Thank you to Jim for those 2 episodes. We'd like to think that you have a clearer picture of the Manchester now and can better see its importance in Avro heritage. If you've enjoyed these 2 episodes, don't forget that if you like or follow the podcast and you have push notifications switched on in your device, then you will receive an alert when a new episode has been released. We very much hope that you will be joining us again before too long, but for now, it's goodbye until the next time. Cheerio.